Hello everyone. I'm Professor Neha Yadav, a faculty in the area of marketing from Flame University, and today we are going to talk about the module Consumer Behavior. Before we get along onto the module, let me take you through some learning objectives. We all are consumers and we take this status quite for granted. We are also complex and irrational creatures, and we get into this behavior with a lot of complexity. And therefore, it becomes very imperative for the marketer to understand what goes in the minds of the consumer and how and why does the consumer behave the way he behaves. Let me take you through the learning objectives that we are going to cover in this particular module. So, to begin with, we'll start off with the learning objective of knowing what consumer behavior is. I'll take you through some of the basic definitions of consumer behavior, and it'll introduce you to the process of consumer buying. The next learning objective is going to be discussing on the differences between the different types of needs. As a marketer, it is important to understand the reason for why the consumer is making a purchase, and therefore it is imperative that we understand the consumer's needs, wants, and demands. The second objective is also going to talk about the difference between functional and psychological needs. The third learning objective is going to also talk about the factors that impact the information search. We will discuss next the post-purchase outcomes, which can be in the form of satisfaction, it could cause dissonance, and also loyalty that some of the customers depict when it comes to making most of the purchases. We are next going to talk about listing the different factors that affect the consumer decision-making process, and we will end this particular module by talking about how involvement influences the consumer decision process. Let us begin the journey. Let us start with defining consumer behavior. Philip Kotler, the marketing guru, has defined consumer behavior as a study on how and why the consumers are making purchases. It is not just individuals, but also organizations and also groups which are acting as communities that make purchases. Essentially, this entire cycle of consumer behavior deals with selecting, which is the choice of the good, subsequently making a purchase, which is buying the product, using the product, and this entire cycle ends with even disposal. Disposal in the subsequent sections will be taken care of in the module because it becomes very, very important for a marketer to also make the consumer aware about how to dispose a certain product for making him or encouraging him to make subsequent purchases or repeat purchases. Let us now look at the different types of products that are being purchased or the consumers buy. So the products are of different types. They can be tangible goods, intangible services, they are ideas, and they are also experiences. Now, essentially, in consumer behavior, we talk about how and why the consumer is making the purchase decisions. Consumer behavior as a domain also derives the motivation from sociology and psychology. Let me take you through the entire process of consumer decision making step by step. Let us now try and disintegrate the definition of consumer behavior as discussed earlier. So this definition was given by Philip Kotler, and he says that consumer behavior refers to a study. So essentially, consumer behavior is a study that derives its roots from sociology and psychology. Sociology because it deals with people, and psychology because we are also talking about the minds of the consumers and what goes behind making purchase decisions. So consumer behavior is a study, and there are three different entities that are involved in consumer behavior. One is the individuals. The second is groups or communities. And the third is organization. So apart from business to consumer buying, which deals with consumer behavior and consumer buying, we also take care of consumer buying when it comes to organizations. This particular module is going to deal with consumer buying behavior in the B2C domain. So there are three entities that are involved in consumer buying, and we talk about how the consumers are selecting the product, which is choice, buying the product, which is making the purchase, then using the product, which is again very, very important as to how the consumer is using the product, and subsequently also ends with disposal, In further this module, we are going to also focus on the disposal aspect of consumer buying. It is very, very critical for the marketer to make the consumer aware about how to dispose the product so that the consumer is encouraged to make repeat purchases and also knows about the life cycle of the product. So consumer behavior is a study about individuals, groups and organizations, and it also deals with how the consumer selects, buys, uses and disposes the goods. It is not only the tangible or intangible goods, but there are ideas, services, experiences, and many other aspects of the products that are being marketed by the marketer, and therefore to understand all the nuances of consumer buying behavior becomes very, very critical. So if I were to put this in a nutshell, consumer behavior is a study about individual groups and organizations to decipher about how the consumers select, buy, use and dispose the product, and to deal with the how and why of the entire consumer decision-making process. Next in line, we are going to talk about the steps, the different stages in the consumer buying decision process. Essentially, there are 5 stages in the consumer buying decision process. The first stage starts with need recognition, or we call it as problem identification. What could this problem or need be? One of your products might have undergone wear and tear, you might have stocked out, or you just might want to try out a new product. That's where the need arises. At this juncture, it is also important for me to introduce you to the concept of needs, wants, and demands. If I were to ask you a very simple question on what is the difference between the 3, most of us use all the 3 interchangeably. However, there is a very fundamental difference that exists between the 3. Needs, as we see, are the basic needs, the fundamental necessities in life, which is housing, clothing, food, sleep, recreation. These days, even education has become a need. So anything that is acting as a basic necessity or fundamental necessity for living is called as a need. I might be hungry. I can do with a simple food at home. However, I desire or I wish to have pizza for my lunch. That is when I'm directing the need, which is hunger, to a specific object, which is pizza, and it becomes my desire or want. Therefore, we can conclude that needs, when they are directed towards a specific object, are called as desires or wants. Now, just basis this desires or wants is not when the marketer is going to develop a certain product or introduce a certain product into the marketplace. There has to be some substantial aspect that should trigger him, motivate him, encourage him, and also it should become profitable for him to introduce this product into the marketplace. Hence, it is very important for these desires to also culminate into something which is called as a demand. Now, this particular demand is defined as the willingness and ability to pay. So when needs and wants or desires are backed up by an ability to pay is when they are culminating into demands. So it is very, very important to keep in mind the ability to pay aspect of the demand. Coming back to the first stage in consumer buying behavior, which is need recognition. Now, needs are again of different types. The 2 fundamental types of needs are functional needs and psychological needs. Let us see as to what is the difference between the functional and the psychological needs. When I make a certain purchase, suppose I'm purchasing a smartphone or a technology-led product or a gadget, I'm looking at the features of the product, I'm looking at the utility aspect of it, I'm rationally making this decision, and I'm largely depending on, the functional aspect of the product for making the decision. So, there is a lot of rationality to my purchase. When I'm looking at the performance of the product and I'm assessing the performance of the product based on the features that I can see through. So that is called as where I'm focusing all my purchase decisions on the utility of the product, is when it is called as the functional need. Subsequently, there are other types of needs that exist. Suppose I see a very interesting gadget in my friend's hand, or my peers are using something which is like highly technologically savvy product, and there is this prestige that I think the friend is deriving out of possessing that product or the ownership of the product. I'll base my purchase based on something that is happening psychologically or emotionally, and therefore this particular type of need is largely based on the intangible aspect of making the purchase. So this is essentially based on the emotional aspect of making a purchase. At this juncture, it is also important for you to also know about product acting as an offering. An offering is nothing but a combination of two different types of benefits. The two different types of benefits are tangible benefits, which are functional in nature, and intangible benefits, which are more psychological in nature, which have to do with happiness, heightened state of emotion, status, prestige that I derive of ownership of a product. So the first aspect or the first step in consumer buying is when I'm making the purchase, when I'm trying to identify where there's going to be a future purchase based on the need recognition. These needs can be of two types, functional and psychological. Alright, let us now go to the second stage in the consumer decision-making process. The second stage in the consumer decision-making process is information search. Once I have, as a consumer, recognized needs, is when I will try and search for a lot of information. Now, this information search is very, very critical because I need to have enough inputs to make a purchase. This information search is also of two different types. There is an internal information search that I do, and there is an external information search that I'm doing as a consumer. Internal information search is largely dependent upon my individual self, which is based on my past experiences. I might have used a certain brand, I would have liked it, or I may have disliked it, and therefore I might try and not buy the product or buy the product. This internal search is also dependent on the kind of knowledge that I have about the product category. I'm not a traveler, so I might not resort to a lot of information from my internal self. I may not have a lot of knowledge about different places where I can maybe travel during vacation, and therefore I lack knowledge. So I will base my information search on external sources, and I will shift to the external sources of information. Now, this external sources of information, so this, before we go ahead, so this is going to be largely self, your own past experiences and knowledge about the product category. So I'll write past experiences also here. All right. And if this doesn't suffice, I move on to the external search and external sources of information. Now, this external sources could be, one that the consumers like the most, which is the online search. It could be the offline search. I would base my information search on television. I might hear something on radio, very, very conventional mode of, information search. I might also resort to some peers, some recommendations from them. I'll resort to my friends and family, right? So this all becomes my external information search. Now, again, information search is not as simple as we look at it. There are a lot of factors that are influencing the information search here. The first factor that influences my information search is the way that I do between perceived benefits that I derive of the product versus the costs. Now, it is important to understand that there is a weighing in the mind of the consumer, which is talking about perceived benefits of the product versus the costs that are involved. When I talk about the costs that are involved, we know about benefits. Benefits can be of two types, tangible and intangible benefits. However, when we are talking about the costs incurred or perceived costs that are incurred in procuring the product or change in ownership, we are also focusing on the time, effort that is taken for information search, the time and effort that we take to go and procure that particular product as to where it is available, where is it distributed, and the corpus, the money that we are investing in making that particular purchase, and therefore I'm deriving some value. So in my mind as a consumer, I'm weighing the perceived benefits versus costs. So if the perceived benefits are very, very high when it comes to costs, I might do a little less of an information search. However, the perceived costs are high, okay, and the perceived benefits are also very, very high, then there is a lot of involvement that I have, and then I resort myself to doing a lot of information search. So this is one factor. Let me write it down as A, and which is going to act as an important or critical aspect when it comes to information search. Let us look at, is there something else that is also, going to impact my information search? The next aspect is the locus of control. Like we said, consumer behavior derives a lot of its understanding from psychology and sociology. Locus of control comes from psychology. Essentially, locus of control is nothing but the ability of an individual to think that whether he or she is responsible for any type of decision that is made. So how in control of situation do I feel as a consumer is my locus of control. So locus of control again are of two different types. The first one is the internal locus of control, and there is an external locus of control. If I'm an individual who is largely having internal locus of control, wherein I'm responsible, I think that I'm responsible for most of the purchase decisions that I make, and when I make those purchase decisions, I'll be largely involved in that particular situation and be responsible for that situation and the consequences thereafter. It means that the consumer is very, very high on internal locus of control. In an external locus of control, I'm leaving it to the fate. So whatever search I do, whatever decision I make, it is going to be external factors that are going to be largely responsible for that purchase, and I'm nowhere responsible for making this particular purchase, is when I say that I'm a consumer with an external locus of control. So when I'm doing an internal locus of control, or when I'm a consumer which has got internal locus of control, I'll be responsible for the consequences of making purchase, and therefore I'll be involved in more of an information search. Subsequently, when I'm somebody who has an external locus of control, I'll do less of an information search, and I'll not base my decisions on a lot of information search, because which anyways I consider myself to be not responsible for any consequence that is arising out of making that particular purchase. So that's the second aspect of when it comes to factors that are impacting the information search. Let us move on to looking at